The Oxygen 365 podcast brings you the best relationship research, advice, and practical ideas from experts in all aspects of relationships and family. Get ready to join our host, Noel Metter, with this week's guest.
Welcome to the Oxygen Show. I'm Noel Metter, your host, and this is episode number 56. Today we have a special guest with us, Karen Herold. She's a transition counselor, and before becoming a counselor, she was a successful business executive. She's the mother of 3 daughters and 2 grandchildren, and she has a master's in transpersonal psychology. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Noel. I'm really excited and happy to be here today.
Well, I'll tell you, this topic that we're going to be getting into on transition, I think all of us, in some way, it fundamentally touches us. Whether we're transitioning from an active deployment, coming back home, or we're a veteran transitioning out, or we're just a mother, father who's raised 3 kids and now they're leaving the home and we're moving into the empty nest stage. All of us, in some way, have experienced transition, and really Karen is an expert in this space. She's worked with many, many people, helping them understand what is at stake in the transition and what goes into that transition to make it successful. And so I want to start with this, Karen. What have you found, as you've worked with folks, to be kind of the core issues that oftentimes come up during transition?
Well, Noel, I think the first thing is recognizing just what transition is. So the word change and transition are often used interchangeably, but they actually are 2 different things. Change is an external circumstance, the end of a deployment, your spouse coming back. For children, their parents both being in the home after one has been gone. All of those are external circumstances. Transition is the internal emotional process that you go through in reaction to a change. And sometimes it's no big deal. You can have a change and, you have some frustrations and new things that you have to do, new ways of doing things, but you move on pretty easily. Sometimes we find ourselves stuck and we just cannot get our feet underneath us. We cannot find that sense of everything moving in a normal way, and that is transition. And so in answer to your question in a simple way, the biggest challenge is recognizing that you are in transition and then honoring that process and allowing it to do its work in you and to help you to move on to the next stage in your life.
And I think you're so right in terms of understanding the difference between change and transition. And one of the things that oftentimes comes up in this is, and it depends on who we're talking about, but I know in the community that we serve, a lot of times a transition will have specific modalities that are focused on, like, hey, I'm transitioning, and so I need to look at the career, or I'm transitioning and there's going to be a different community. And the approach is good in some sense, but I think it lacks the bigger picture as we're talking about transition. And for you, I mean, when you are helping someone go through that, what are some of the core ways that you help them see the bigger picture of their transition? And what are the elements? Kind of break down for us. What are the steps that go through the process of transition?
So based on the work of William Bridges, who wrote a book in 2004 called Transition, he identified 3 stages of transition. And so I began by just outlining those. And I believe that awareness of these different stages is a really important part of moving through them. So the first stage is the ending. Something ends. And if you think about what happens with an ending, there's always all sorts of busyness. So you sell a house, or a job comes to an end, or you move, and there's so many details to take care of, and you're busy, closing up the old house, moving, whatever it is. There's all of these things that have to happen in order for something to end. And then one day you wake up and it's all done and you are quiet and you are like, what's next? And that brings you into that second stage of transition, which is called the neutral zone. And this is where a lot of the real work of transition happens. And that happens when you allow yourself to experience all of the emotions that come along with it. And what we find a lot of the time is that rather than sitting with the discomfort of not knowing what's next, people will make changes, one change after another, to avoid realizing that they need to sit and experience those emotions of discomfort and not knowing. And only when they do that will they get to the point that they can begin to envision the third and final stage, which is a new beginning. A new beginning means a new job, a new way of being in your life, a new vision of what your future is, a new title for yourself, a new sub-personality. So you go from being a soldier with a very clear vision of what that means, that's taken away from you. What do you call yourself now? And more importantly, that name signifies something very clear inside of you. What do you know yourself as? And what does that represent for you? And how do you show up in the world? Yeah. Because what you were before, it no longer exists. Yeah. And so that transition of letting go of the old one, grieving, saying goodbye, sitting with that discomfort of not knowing what's next, and then finally moving into what is new and having a clear vision.
So when you talk about those three different phases of transition, what I think I've seen, and I'd love to hear any stories that you might have, and removing names, of course, but stories of clients that you've worked with that have kind of started with the first phase, and then they leap to the third phase, right? Which they're wanting to move from, this change, but ultimately having that new beginning start really, really quickly. Maybe tell us a little bit about why do people jump so quickly from first to third phase, but they don't actually take time to actually process the middle phase?
Because the in-between part is uncomfortable. So the in-between part is first, part of the ending is saying goodbye to what existed before, and there is grief, there is loss as part of that. Those are difficult feelings to take in. And then after that, there is a host of feelings around not knowing what's next. And that doesn't fit in well with our society and our culture, where we're always supposed to be moving forward and knowing what we're doing. And to not know and to just sit with that is a challenging thing to do, and to let it have the time that it takes in order for you to experience that, allow creativity to happen before you're starting the new beginning. That takes intention, and I use that word a lot in my practice. Going through this with intention means that you allow difficult, uncomfortable feelings to happen, and you don't make changes to avoid them, and you don't use other ways of numbing out, such as drugs, alcohol, making physical changes, working too hard, exercising too much. All of those ways are ways that we numb, and we avoid feeling uncomfortable feelings. So transition includes experiencing the uncomfortable feelings so that they're not just buried, because they will happen. They will come up again. If you don't do them now, if you don't allow them to have voice and experience now, they will come up later.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think you're right in terms of how it bubbles out in some of these behaviors that are probably going to be self-sabotaging. They're going to be harmful. What would you say, though, in that uncomfortable space, what are some of the practical ways that you help and you coach your clients through in terms of them being able to deal with the uncomfortableness? Yeah. What does that look like?
So the biggest practices that I encourage are meditation, prayer, contemplation, time in nature, creative practices. All of those practices are ways that you listen and that you embrace the time of quiet and allowing experience to happen. So as you're meditating, thoughts are going to come up. That's what meditation is. Thoughts come up, and you'll have the understanding of, oh, I really don't like this. This feels bad. Good. You have knowledge of that. You can intentionally experience, I don't like this. That's okay. That's good.
Yeah.
And once you have the ability and the space to experience that through hiking in the woods or through time spent sitting on a meditation bench or through prayer and contemplation and listening to the divine power say, yeah, you need to just be in this space right now, then you have a chance to start creative energy. There's space for creative energy to build and to allow you to envision what is possible.
That's so good. And I think it is easier to go towards the numbing versus being in that space of the uncomfortable. And yet the fruit of the uncomfortable is what ultimately gets them to the place of new beginning, right? Exactly. And I think that's where I see a lot of people, they get stuck. They get stuck because they're numbing the pain. And those activities, whatever you fill in your choice of medication, right? You mentioned a few of them, but there's a lot, right?
There's a lot.
There's a lot of different ways to do that, but it never gets them to the place where they're actually moving into that new beginning. Right. And so my question is this. I think a lot of this has to do with identity, right? So when we talk about transition, identity's at the core epicenter. Why is it so hard for the identity to change in an individual?
Well, you had asked earlier about some examples.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to
love it.
My own example.
Oh, good. Even better.
When I ended my time as mother, and so this was mother to children in the home, and that was such a strong root of my self-image, of everything about me. Everything that I did was because I was a mother. I worked the job I did so that I could make money to pay for my kids to do what they wanted to. I worked as hard as I did in all of the activities. I had the house that I had. Everything that I did was based on my sub-personality of mother. And all of a sudden, all three of my daughters are gone. It happened almost in one summer. And I'm not a mother anymore. So what am I if I'm not mother? And finding what you are after something that you love is taken away from you takes time. You don't even know. You really don't know without taking that time in the neutral zone to say, what can I be? What do I want to be? What do I want this next stage in my life to include? And how do I envision myself? If I have the ability to make that decision, how do I envision myself? How do I want to call myself? And as you say, what is that image? So another really great practice is imaging. And I take students on, or I take my clients often on imaginal journeys. So if you go into a relaxed state and you're led through some kind of imaginal journey where you go and climb a mountain and you meet a wise being, what is this wise being saying to you? And that's actually your heart, yourself, who is saying, this is what you really could do. This would be a really great next stage for you.
Yeah, and one thing that I've heard in this journey that many are in, that transition, whether you're like you in motherhood, there is these core connecting, and I don't know, I think you maybe mentioned it as like a sub personality or a sub, or it's kind of defining who you are at a certain stage of your life. Yes. And so to that end, how does someone begin to understand what was some of those sub personalities and then moving into that new beginning where it's being redefined into something else?
Well, that moves back to that ending time. So the ending. it's really important, again, that you intentionally recognize what you're saying goodbye to. So you're saying goodbye to that image you had of yourself. Perhaps it's soldier, perhaps it is single parent because you are the only one taking care of your family. And that is going away. And there's many good things about that, but it's also a sad time because there's a part of you that you had invested into that and is your image of yourself. You were successful at it, it defined you. And so there is grief and sadness about that. But first, you have to recognize it. That was a part of me that isn't going to be a part of me in the future. Mm-hmm. Once that's done, you are ready then for the time of the neutral zone, which leads into creativity. So all of these things are emotions, which are a type of energy. So by moving out the emotions of grief and loss and that energy, we allow the energy of creativity to come into our life. And that's what allows us to start saying, I could be an artist. Mm-hmm. I could be a business person. I could be a professional coach. All of these things that you have in you have room and space then to come into your mind space, and you can start to create what your image would look like, what your new life could look like. Mm-hmm. But without taking the time to close and grieve what's happened, to release the emotions, the energy of that, you don't create space for finding out what is possible.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I think becomes a reality in this is that most of the time that you're transitioning, you're not doing this independently, right? So there's someone else connected to you, whether it's a spouse, a partner, kids, and that dynamic can oftentimes be painful because where you're wanting to maybe slow down and take time to grieve what's ending, your partner, spouse might be saying, I don't want to slow down. I want to keep moving forward. Like, we just need to change and move on. Yeah. How do you coach people that are in that dynamic where one spouse is potentially putting pressure on them to just adopt and change and move on, where the other one's saying, hey, I need time to grieve this and to really sit in that uncomfortable space. Right. That dynamic, how do you deal with that?
Well, you were just saying it so well. I mean, the key point is communication and being able to say, I need you to give me the space to do this. And I understand where you're moving towards right now, but we have to be able to move as a couple at the same speed. Mm-hmm. Or we have to move at our own speeds for a while and then realize we'll come back together at a later time. Mm-hmm. But that is about communication. The key point is communication and boundary setting. You know, that is a boundary saying, I can't move. I can't move yet. I understand that you are. I can't get there with you. Yeah. But again, those are really important relationship skills that are covered in some of the other classes that you have. How do you develop those skills as a couple? How do you redevelop them once you've been apart? Yeah. You've been apart for a while. You forget how to communicate in couple speak.
Yeah, right? It's so true. It's so true.
The intention to renegotiate and reframe your relationship as you're going through this. And you mentioned just briefly another really important point, and that's that kids can be going through this at the same time. So you have a whole family going through transition, and they're all at different speeds, and some have stronger or weaker communication skills. It takes assistance. You know, a lot of times it takes your community, it may take a professional, all of those to help you negotiate this in a way that can ultimately bring everyone through it. And the really great thing about intentional transition is that it is an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. It opens the door for really taking the time to say, this is what we want.
Yeah.
This is what each one of us wants, and let's take the time to make sure that we can all get there.
Yeah.
Support each other doing that.
So I've got to ask the question. I don't know if there is a defined answer for this, but when it comes to those three stages that you've mentioned, is there a time sequence? I mean, are we talking years? Are we talking months? Are we talking weeks for someone to go from the beginning stage to the ending stage? What does that look like?
Yes, it can be all of those.
Okay, so years.
It could be. It could be for somebody. So this was my experience, again, back to when I made that transition. I spent a lot of time making change after change after change after change before I realized that that wasn't the answer.
Wow.
So the longer that you defer dealing with those emotions and allowing them space, the longer it's going to take.
Yeah. That's such a good answer, because I think you're right. It could only take a couple of months, but many take years because they're chasing these other ways of change that aren't actually addressing the core issue.
And the other part that comes into this is how many times you've delayed or ignored a previous transition and dealing with those emotions too. Because when grief, for instance, it's such a great example. You experience grief, if you ever have, you know that every other time that you've experienced it, it comes back up. It comes back again. Your grandfather died, and then 20 years later, your father died. Guess what? You go back and you get to live when your grandfather did again. It's just the way it is. It reminds us, and we get to experience that again. So if you have a lot of those things that haven't been dealt with, they can make the process take a little bit longer too.
Yeah.
I think the biggest predictor is intentionality. How intentional are you about the fact that you are in transition, that you are going to honor that, and that you are going to take the time and space and let that happen and envision what is next for you. Mm-hmm. The more that you focus on doing that with intention, the shorter the time it's going to take.
Yeah. And so I'm coming to the end of my questions. I one question that came up, and even as we're talking through this, I think these macro level transitions are generally on the radar, like we've identified, when it comes to motherhood ending, and there's, I don't think it ends ever, but there's a transition to empty nest, or there's the transition of my identity as the military, and now I'm transitioning back into civilian life. Those are macro. Do you find that transition is on a micro level as well? And is that something that do we need to pay attention to that, or do we just stay at the level of macro?
Well, the thing that's interesting is that you're not ever sure when something is going to push you into transition. Mm-hmm. So for many people coming back from deployment, it can be like no big deal. I come back, it's different. My daily schedule is different. I have to figure out again how to do this. Not a transition, it's a change. You deal with the change. But there are certain times in our lives when changes happen that throw us into a transition, and it can be small. For me, it could be small by saying a pet dies. For other people, that's a major thing. Mm-hmm. So a change is in the eye of the beholder. A major change is in the eye of the beholder. Wow. So a very small thing, an accident, a car accident, we all have those throughout our lives, and it can be a very small thing. It can change you into not trusting anything in life. That is transition.
Yeah.
So there's other factors that are going into this that are not fully understood yet, which is why I am continuing to study and research transition, because
It is major. It's major themes in our lives, and trying to get a greater understanding, both for me individually, but as a culture, is going to help all of us.
Yeah.
I think you have interviewed someone before who had developed ceremony in order to help people in transition.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is so important and so missing in our culture. We don't have the ceremonies that mark moving from stages of life, from child to teen to adult. We don't have the ceremonies that mark the ending of a warrior's life as they come back into our culture, which is not a warrior culture as much.
Yeah.
Ceremony is so important. And how can we study that and bring awareness of that so that we bring that into the lives of our families and our communities?
Yeah.
I think there's so much that we can understand that will help us both individually, but as a culture also, to support our family members and our friends and loved ones.
You're right. And I think that's one of the things that I'm connecting with, is that there's the need to be in that space where it's uncomfortable and you're just meditating prayer, which is more of isolation. I mean, isolation to a degree, but then there's the element of community being a part of that transition and the support system that you have around you to help walk through this. And I know that's part of what your practice is to provide that support on an individual basis to your clients. But I think the other part is, like you were mentioning, the ceremony that there's a support network there, even in that ceremony, that's initiating the process and saying, hey, we're going to go with you through this. We understand what you're going through. Have you found that to be true, that community is a big part of helping the transition be smooth?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Finding a community to celebrate ceremony with, that is a commitment. And thinking about the ceremonies that we have, a wedding, a funeral. The important part of that is the community coming together, celebrating or grieving with you, and setting almost the cultural understanding of the event and saying, this is how we do marriage.
Yeah.
This is how we celebrate that. This is what it means.
Yeah.
And what that means is it gives you context. So community in ceremony provides context for transition.
I love it. What would be kind of final question to someone right now who is in transition that is potentially doing what we're addressing, which is running after change or maybe numbing the pain? What would you say to them?
What I would say is go out and buy the book Transitions by William Bridges. It's an easy read.
Yeah.
So I would say, if nothing else, get awareness around that. Secondly, find people that you can talk to.
Yeah.
And who you can say, this is kind of harder than I thought it was going to be, and who you can have support with. And then obviously, I feel like you should find someone to walk with you, a coach or a counselor, who is going to help you to identify those feelings and emotions that may, especially for males, are a lot harder to access and therefore are more important to access.
And I'll just say that your website, wisetransition.com, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, you actually have the opportunity for our listeners is to go to wisetransition.com, and there's a kind of a intake that you do where it's a 30-minute kind of learn what your transition and see if there's maybe an opportunity to work with them walking alongside. So, and I know that you also have great resources on your website around this very topic that we're discussing here. And so, Karen, I just want to say thank you so much is there anything else that you'd want to say about your kind of what you do in helping people in this transition space as a counselor?
I really don't know. I think you have asked such great questions, and that we have touched on the really important aspects of it.
Yeah.
And so I thank you for that opportunity, because this is my passion.
Yeah.
And so having an opportunity to share and to raise awareness around this as an important time in life, it is exciting for me.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, your passion shows, and that's what I love. I'm so glad that you're on this show, because I think this is one of those topics that's least discussed, and there's very little information out there, and yet many people are struggling, and they're kind of just grappling with, how do I get through this, looking at the change that needs to happen, but not having the support to get through that. So thank you for your life work and really pouring into this. It's been an honor to have you, and hopefully we'll have you back, and we can talk more about maybe some of these other elements of the transition.
Yeah, that would be my pleasure, Noel. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
You too. Bye.